Hello, good evening, and welcome to FashMash Pioneers, the monthly speaker series where Rachel Arthur and I bring together the world's brightest minds shaping the future of fashion. When Rachel Arthur and I co-founded FashMash 9 years ago, our business mission was as clear then as it is now. It's to encourage open dialogue and sharing of ideas to drive forward the future of fashion. Tonight, we have one leading light doing just that. Her name is Ayesha Barenblat, and I cannot wait to hear the interview between her and Rachel this evening. Before we delve deeper into the topic that we're going to be covering, I wanted to thank our sponsor, Klaviyo. They have been sponsoring us for a year now, and they are an e-commerce marketing company focused on brands of all types and sizes, from Hummingbird Bakery to 111 Skin. They provide precision marketing and precise targeting, and I'm very happy to say that FashMash also use them for all of our email marketing, and we have been very, very impressed with the results. If you would like to try them for yourselves, it's just to go to klaviyo.com/fashmash. That's klaviyo.com/fashmash, and you can start your free trial there. Now, tonight, this week marks Fashion Revolution Week, a focal point of the Sustainable Fashion Year, centered on building a better future for the fashion industry. Founded 8 years ago, it was really started because of the Rana Plaza disaster, which I'm sure none of you can forget, the time which killed 1,138 people. And it happened 8 years ago this week. What a time to emphasize the interconnectedness of sustainability like we are this evening, a topic which many of you may remember we discussed last year with activist Vandana Tiwari as part of the speaker series. The Rana Plaza disaster was thought at the time to be a wake-up call for the industry, a turning point where we would all sit up and listen to the great social inequality happening. However, sadly, like many disaster headlines, it did not lead to the transformation and the reset for which so many had hoped. That's exactly why Ayesha Barenblat's Pay Up campaign was so potent when introduced this time last year at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I'm sure many of you remember, fashion brands refused to pay an estimated $40 billion worth of unpaid bills for finished goods. The catastrophic result saw millions of garment workers laid off around the world, resulting in the largest humanitarian crisis the sector has ever seen. Pay Up held brands to account, and it made a real impact. They recouped an estimated $15 billion in the process. It's a huge, huge achievement, but there's still a long way to go. And this evening, Ayesha will be telling us about the next incarnation of this campaign, Pay Her, which focuses on gender injustice. A little bit more about Ayesha. She is founder and CEO of non-profit organization Remake, which aims to ignite a conscious consumer movement. Remake's films, stories, and immersive journeys rebuild human connection with the women who make our clothes. As a social entrepreneur, she has a long history in building sustainable supply chains that respect both people and the planet. From leading brand engagement at Better Work, a World Bank and United Nations partnership focused on working conditions, to her role at BSR, where she worked and advised major brands from Nike to H&M to Levi's on the design and integration of sustainability into their businesses. We are honored that she is able to join us, and I have been looking forward to this conversation for so long. It really is such a highlight for me of Fashion Revolution Week and such an important conversation to be having. Before we dig in, I just wanted to remind you of tonight's charity. Tonight's donations, I should say, because Remake is a non-profit organization. Since the start of the pandemic, we do not charge for tickets for these talks like we used to. However, we do ask for a donation for the speaker's time and expertise that they are sharing. The speaker always chooses a charity of their choice. And of course, this evening, Ayesha wanted donations to go to Remake, and all of the work that they do to empower women to advocate for fair wages and eliminate injustice in the fashion system. Please give what you can. FashMash also makes donations every month. And to date, we have supported charities including Shelter, the Prince's Trust, and SmartWorks. A couple of notices. Please do share your questions in the Q&A bar that you can find at the bottom of the screen. We have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of this evening. Also, if you'd like to just share any ideas, you can put them into the chat little box, or you can, of course, share them on social media under the hashtag FashMash. Right, in that case, no more from me. I'm going to hand over to Rachel and Ayesha. Please turn on your videos and unmute yourselves.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rosanna, and Ayesha, thank you for being here. As Rosanna said, we've been so looking forward to this conversation. I feel like there's so much to dig into. We're going to try and do it in about 40 minutes, which might be a little bit ambitious, but let's see how we get on. Obviously, a really crucial week for us to be talking in is Fashion Revolution Week. So thank you for making yourself available and for talking to us about such an important cause. Rosanna's given us a really nice starting place, I think, with the sort of context of the Pay Up campaign, but I'd love to hear it in your own words, sort of why you launched it, what the premise of it was, and so forth, if you'd be so kind as to begin us there.
Absolutely, Rachel. Well, hello, everyone. I am so delighted to be here. You know, pre-joining this, Rachel and I were laughing about how we are all zoomed out to an extent. And so I really do hope for today to be interactive, for you all to keep your conversation flowing, and for us to really have a provocative and meaningful discussion. So, you know, 13 months ago, the pandemic really changed all of our lives. Many of us were sheltering in place, likely not buying very much. We were hunkering down in sweatpants, and you know, it seems like top sales were up, but no one was buying bottoms anymore. And essentially what happened is the industry panicked. The industry panicked because no one had seen the nature of this sort of pandemic shock. Retail stores around the world were closed as people were not really taking those buying conversations online. And so the industry made the catastrophic decision to essentially cancel $40 billion worth of contracts. I remember very early in the pandemic, I believe it was end of February, early March, where I watched a YouTube clip by Rana Huq, who's the BGMEA, which is the Industry Association in Bangladesh. She heads that up. And she was just making an open plea to the world. She was saying, look, these goods have already been made. Many of them already been shipped. They're on their ships headed to the UK, to the US. Workers have spent untold hours doing this work. If you don't pay your bills, this is going to lead to people protesting on the streets, social unrest in a way that we've never seen. Please, all we're asking you to do is to honor your bills. And I watched the clip again and again. And honestly, as someone who's been in this industry for a really long time, it really set in that even though we often remember Rana Plaza and, you know, the imagery will never leave us around how catastrophic this decision was, knowing that workers already live in poverty wages, knowing that she lives paycheck to paycheck, determining how much she's to eat, whether or not she can make rent, I knew that there was nothing else that was more important for us to work on. The Remake team is very small. We're an all-women team that are able to pivot very quickly. And so listening to Rana, listening to some researchers on the volume of cancellations, we were very quick to say, all right, there's nothing else we're going to focus on. We are going to demand that brands pay up. And I will tell you, Rachel, in the early days, as we sat on our new Zoom screens, holding up handmade signs to say, pay up, I wasn't sure whether people would pay attention. You know, we didn't have the ability to do street protests. We were sure that people were suffering at home, dealing with kids and job losses. Would anyone pay attention? But we really struck a nerve. And I think we struck a nerve because people were really starting to see how the inequities baked in the fashion system were impacting all of us. Whether you were a retail worker furloughed in London or here in San Francisco, whether you were an Amazon warehouse worker made to work sooner, faster, harder, there was this solidarity that we all felt around. This is not charity. We're just asking for basic good business practice. The goods have already been stitched. The work has already been done. You need to pay up. And so, you know, you can probably still hear the emotion in my voice. It was just the absolute right thing to do. But I think it also begs the broader question of how dehumanized the makers of our clothes are in the fashion system, and how for so long we have continued to pump out cheap product faster and faster at the very cost of her livelihood and her life. And so I think there's a lot of lessons learned from Pay Up around, if we are to truly build back better, which is what a lot of fashion brands are now talking about. It's Earth Month and it's Rana Plaza's anniversary, it's Fashion Revolution Week. Well, then we must center the women who make our clothes. We must push for living wages. We must get smarter regulation in place.
So I want to dig into so many of those latter bits that you just said, but just jumping back a little bit, you said, I'm not going to repeat it perfectly, but you basically said that it's good common business sense to have actually paid up, you know, to do these things. And yet obviously we haven't seen all of the businesses paid up. I know that you're not afraid. I'm certainly not afraid of naming and shaming here. I would love to hear from you, you know, not only who hasn't, but why haven't they? Why are they telling you, or are they just not responding? You know, what have the responses been like from those that haven't yet actually made those commitments?
Yeah. So, you know, it was very much a triggered response in terms of who came to the table immediately, who came to the table with some pushing and prodding, and who remains largely silent. This is where I think really there's a story of hope baked in here, because, you know, we were talking about the worker solidarity that we saw, but we also saw a lot of citizens around the world just demanding, you know, that this is not right. And for some of the brands who eventually came to the table, like a Levi's and a Gap, one of the things that they shared with us was, well, you guys made it untenable for us to sell anything online. You know, stores were closed. Every time we tried to have a flash sale or some type of conversation online, it was virtually impossible because your community would just take up Instagram, Twitter, all of our handles, and this demand pay up, pay up, pay up. So I want to make it very clear that a lot of the brands who came to the table didn't do it from the goodness of their hearts, right? They did it because of the reputational damage and recognition that this was just not worth it. And what I find fascinating from some of those backdoor conversations was, when it became reputationally untenable, then the brands found the money to pay up. So it's interesting, right? I think it was very much treated as a supply chain saving. If you go back and hear investor calls from some of those early days, that's literally what a lot of CFOs and fashion brands said, was we are shoring up savings in the supply chain in order to weather the pandemic, which is just fancy words of saying we're not going to pay our bills so that we have some cash on hand to look better. Now, of the brands that have still not paid up, you know, the Worker Rights Consortium, whose research we really heavily rely on, they have a network of suppliers that they survey. I think part of it is some of them have entered bankruptcy proceedings. And so, you know, for those brands, it really does beg the question of, when you are a manufacturer, you're essentially last in line. And so we really do need bankruptcy reform. And, you know, you can put a bunch of brands in that category: JCPenney, Kohl's, you know, our Arcadia, Topshop. And then there's the brands who I think simply have not responded whatsoever. And what's interesting is that some of them do have this connection to, you know, marketing themselves as sustainable, but have been completely silent, blocking us online, not responding to our messaging. Urban Outfitters, which is part of Anthropology and Free the People, are one of those. And I think, you know, for a lot of the brands that have refused to pay up, the sense is, well, maybe we'll just weather this storm, and you know, people's attention will move on, because this is what happens with viral moments, right? People pay attention and then they go away, and then onward we'll go.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought up that point about those businesses that have either obviously gone into bankruptcy or been on the brink of collapse, and that sort of reaction, because it has been really interesting seeing the different responses to it all. One of the sides I'm really interested in, I think it's really easy for us to sit here, you know, our homes in London and on the west coast of the US, and to really distance ourselves from it. And by us, I obviously mean, you know, not us working specifically in the industry, working as you are directly on this issue, but general citizens at large. You know, it's really easy for us to sort of see it as something that's happening somewhere else, you know, somewhere that's not related to where we are or who we are or anything else. But of course, one of the things that's become really obvious throughout the pandemic has been that these things are happening at home. You know, they're on our doorstep. And I think that's been really interesting in the UK specifically. Obviously, we saw the scandal in Leicester with Boohoo and everything that happened around that. And we know there's still so much of this going on. So I wanted to ask you, can you share any other insights as to what things are really like on the ground to try and paint a picture for us of why this is so important? You know, whether it's close by, as I said, with the example in Leicester in our case, or of course, there's the forced labor camps in China that have been so in the news recently. There is an overwhelming amount of exploitation, but I feel like there's still this huge disconnect with the average shopper, as we've seen so many of those businesses absolutely skyrocketing during COVID at the same time from a sales point of view.
Yeah. You know, I have a lot of empathy for the average shopper. You know, when I read articles, you know, in the UK press around, oh my gosh, look at these terrible Primark shoppers. They're all lining up to buy things now that the lockdowns have eased. Don't they care about garment makers? And honestly, I think it's not quite fair to pit people against one another in that way. And I think one of the beauties of Pay Up really was that we saw this solidarity, right, across different types of workers, across different types of citizens and people. And, you know, one of the things that I often sit with is that Nazma Akhtar, who's one of our Pay Up partners and coalition leaders, you know, she's a child of the fashion industry, literally was working as a child in the industry, went on to become an amazing union leader. And in the midst of this campaigning, she said to me, sister, do you think that people are going to start to care now that the inequities are starting to wash on their own shores? And I sat with that for a minute. It was interesting, right? Because with all of the offshoring that we've been doing for 30 years, it's really been, well, it's not in my backyard and it's happening somewhere far away. And it's so hard to focus given everything that's going on in my daily life. But as we think about the way that the fashion system has been set up and how global trade has essentially enriched very few people at the very top, who also, by the way, tend to look a certain way, right? It's old white men, we can just say that. And then for the rest of us, whether you are an indie designer, whether you are a retail worker, whether you work in a warehouse, whether you work in Leicester or Los Angeles or Dhaka, the industry, despite being $2.6 trillion in profit, has simply not been there for you. And so I really do hope that as we start to see some of these inequities and injustices a little bit closer to home, it'll be a wake-up call, right? That it really doesn't have to be this way. This is an industry that's highly profitable. This is also an industry that, for the most part, I'd say, unlike other industries, is built on the backs of women. You know, I've always been fascinated by how in fashion design schools, a lot of the people entering are women. And a lot of the fashion industry, if you ask me to paint a picture, you know, who are the people who sit on the factory floor? It's mostly young women in their early 20s, happen to be mostly women of color. And what you have seen over the last 30 years is that everything around her is starting to become more expensive while her wages continue to shrink. And, you know, I think the Leicester example is really interesting because it shows to you that this is not really about failed nations or corruption or, you know, the issues in Bangladesh or Cambodia. Of course, all of those things are true, that, you know, fashion brands are in countries where enforcement of labor laws are weak and labor laws in themselves are weaker. But the fact that it can happen in Leicester and Los Angeles goes to show that the fundamental business model is broken. You know, the biggest preying brands in LA where we have sweatshop conditions is Fashion Nova. You know, in Leicester, we know that it's Boohoo. And so I think for people to really start to recognize that the price of the garment is what has the exploitation baked in it. And that the sooner we get our clothes, the cheaper we get our clothes, the more she is up against shrinking wages, a lack of severance payment, and gender-based violence. Those two things are very connected. You know, the more fashion seasons we've had, the more trends, the more growth of ultra fast fashion, it means that she is being told to work sooner, faster, harder, and up against gender-based violence and verbal assault. So there's very deep connections to the business model and how the women at the other end are treated.
I feel like there's so much to unpack there in terms of your view on what we can start to do to improve that. But because you've mentioned around the gender side of things, and I just want us to mention the fact that your campaign has evolved and is now called Pay Her. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about that, having obviously already given the context as to why.
You know, when you look at a lot of the conversations happening globally and locally, you know, people are really starting to wake up to the endemic sexual harassment that so many of us have faced in the workplace, you know, under the Me Too movement. When we talk about wage parity, we know that women make much less than men. And when it comes to women of color, those numbers plummet even deeper. But I think people haven't made those connections to, well, it's the exact same in the producing nations, in the fashion system as well. You know, of the millions of people that are employed, whether in dye houses, in the cut-sew factories, in the farms, it is predominantly a female workforce. And she is in many, many ways a feminist in her own right. You know, the first women to be entering formal work, to be keeping their brothers and sons in school. She's often the sacrificial child that's trying to make do with very little to give her family a better life. And all of the things that we grapple with as women here in the West, she's up against as well. You know, sexual harassment, intimidation. It's fascinating as someone who's been in so many factories around the world that everyone on the factory floor is usually a woman, and all supervisors and up are men. And so it begs the question, well, where's the Me Too movement for her? And, you know, in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of this gender-based violence really exasperated because of the purchasing practices of brands. You know, a lot of brands are not sure what's going to sell as we keep shutting down and opening up, and they're not sure what people's buying behavior will be like. And what that's meant is that from a production standpoint, they're demanding even more flexibility in the supply chain, right? Brands are wanting things quickly to see what sells. They're wanting to delay payments beyond 60 and 90 days. And all of that means a perfect storm in terms of shrinking wages and gender-based violence for her. And so we really thought, you know, the next iteration of Pay Up should be Pay Her, to paint a picture for everyday citizens to realize that if you care for gender-based violence, if you care for, you know, wanting equal pay for equal work, then we really do have to address the indignities that the very women who power this industry have faced and continue to face. And frankly, it's been exasperated during COVID.
Yeah, exactly. It was very present before, but all the more so during the pandemic. You mentioned I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask you next. You mentioned the idea of hope. That's what I was going to say earlier on. You mentioned this idea of hope, and I'd love to just touch on that a little bit, because, you know, not only have some of the brands indeed gone and paid up, and you've recouped this amazing sum of money, and I know you have ambition for much, much more, but with all of this much wider thing that you've talked about, we would like to think, and to your point around hope, that there are some examples of businesses that are doing the right thing and are moving in the right direction. And I just wondered if you could give us a little bit of an insight as to who some of those are and what some of the things to be celebrated look like within this space, and to learn from, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you asked that question, Rachel, because so much of what we're talking about is quite dark and difficult,
Yeah.
right? And it's easy to get overwhelmed. It's easy to think, well, all right, here's another thing that's a complete mess. So let's just forget about it and move on, because it just is the way it is. And I do think that there is hope to be garnered from a lot of places. So, you know, within Remake, we don't take any money from the fashion industry. We have a seal of approval process where we're looking at a brand's human rights performance, their environmental performance, and essentially we score them. It's on a scale of 0 to 100 with, you know, if you have at least 50 points, it means you're on your way to doing better and to really looking at these things from an intersectional standpoint. And, you know, on our website, remake.world, we have rock star brands. They often happen to be very small, sustainable brands. They've got the founder ethos of wanting to do right. They really understand the connections between people and planet and are not sort of focusing on one area and not the other. There are so many brands within that cohort of the Remake family that I've been so proud of. Sustainable brands, it's really been difficult for them this last year, and
Yeah.
yet they've soldiered on, not just in terms of keeping their market share, but some have reported growing their market share. And that to me is also something that is hopeful, that everyday citizens are also voting with their wallet and rewarding where they can the better brands. I think about Nizzolo, one of my favorite shoe companies, and they run this really fun lowest wage campaign where they ask brands, well, this is what we pay the lowest person in our supply chain. What about you? But it's also a beautiful product, and it's hard to find beautiful product that also talks about living wage within the footwear industry. I think of Mara Hoffman, early in the pandemic, she came to have a chat with me and, was very open about saying business is bleeding and we are hurting, but this is the time for us to be really doubling down on our sustainability commitments rather than walking away. Here within California, we are working on very landmark legislation to essentially eliminate piece rate and have a baseline of minimum wages, $15 an hour for garment makers, because the conditions today in LA are the same as Leicester. And we have built a coalition of over 100 brands that have come in support of the bill. And so I'd say within the brand community, there are a lot of bright spots. But the other thing that really excites me is that we are increasingly seeing more citizen advocacy and activism. I grew up child in Berkeley, United Students Against Sweatshops. We were the people, out there fighting for this. And then over the years, that sort of spirit sort of started to wane, and suddenly people were casting themselves more as sustainable consumers. I frankly hate that term because it's like, when did we become consumers instead of citizens? And somehow we think that we have to curate the most perfect wardrobe and buy ourselves into a sustainable fashion future. And I think PayUp has really debunked that myth that we have to somehow deal with market-based solutions, address all of these inequities and wicked problems in the fashion industry through just buying responsibly. And the citizens who, fired off tweets and wrote on Instagram and signed our PayUp petition, some 270,000 of them, really came back to that citizen advocacy power. And it's those people who are watching the UK parliamentary inquiries really carefully, or looking at the human rights due diligence coming out of Germany, or engaging in this legislation here in California. So I'd say beyond the sustainable brands, what gives me hope is a lot of us coming into our activism and citizen power, rather than thinking that somehow we're going to consume our way into a sustainable fashion future.
And I know you work really closely, well, Elizabeth Klein works very closely with you on the PayUp fashion work. And she, of course, wrote that, what we can probably quite fairly say landmark article last year about exactly this topic, the twilight of the ethical consumer. I wanted to dig into that a bit more because I think it's a really interesting premise, because I feel like, as you said, for a really long time, we have felt that it's on us individually that, but collectively we can change the space by acting with our wallets, really, and only buying from those sustainable businesses, which is, of course, a good thing. But you're saying that actually the sort of activist side of things, the advocacy piece is all the more important. Is that ultimately kind of where you stand on this?
Absolutely. And, Elizabeth and I have had a lot of existential conversations. I joke with her that she's my COVID wife right now. It's someone who I've met, and we have spent the last year tirelessly working behind the scenes on the PayUp campaign. And, we both in some ways had fed into this myth, as I think many of us were, that, it's on us. It's on us to lead these perfect lives, and whether it's zero waste or getting rid of plastic or, feeding our children the most perfect organic food and curating the perfect sustainable capsule collection. And, I've been really struck by how, if that truly is the case, then that means that only rich people can be good people.
Yeah.
And therein lies the conundrum. Like, that's just, the fact that you can buy clothes that are so cheap and so disposable that it costs less than your favorite cup of coffee. Well, that just shouldn't be the case. And the fact that that is out there and that the exploitation is hidden, simply makes it that we're pitting working class people who are already feeling the pain of shrinking wages across the world with, well, you can't afford anything, but you can buy clothes. So I really do think it's a fool's errand to think that somehow voting with our wallets is the solution to some of these very difficult problems around, well, it's not going to stop how much volume of product the industry is pumping out in the world. It's certainly not going to make a dent from any of our climate goals. It doesn't mean that, most of the industry which operates in this race to the bottom is somehow going to pay living wages to the makers of our clothes. So somewhere along the line, and, someone who does a lot of teaching in schools, MBA programs, policy programs, we've started to be fed this myth that all solutions lead to the market and that market-based solutions are the only path forward. And that we've almost lost that muscle of, well, how do you engage in the policy process? Or how do you pass landmark legislation to address some of these wicked problems? And, as I tell a lot of the students in universities, it's like, well, we have to build that muscle back. We certainly have done it, in the past. And if you look at where we've made inroads in the fashion industry, it often has been because of legislation, not because of consumption patterns.
I love that you said wicked problems there as well, and that sort of that very fundamental basis, or super wicked problems, as we know the climate crisis really is. And for anybody that doesn't understand that term, please do go and read John Elkington's work, particularly, as it's so focused on exactly that. But there's so many interesting things that you've just said, and my mind is literally jumping all over the place with excitement, because it's all so interesting and so many things to really consider. But I think just to go to that latter point, for you then, does this all, if we're not looking at market-based solutions, if we're looking at the system at large, does this all really come down to policy and to regulatory reform?
Yes. And, in order for that to happen, we have to have political will. So one of the things that we did, knowing that, in the crisis, we were really focused on order cancellations being paid up, we continue to chase brands to honor their contracts, was we also started to puzzle through, well, where's the direct relief, right? Because demand was plummeting. We knew that workers who were being laid off or furloughed essentially don't have any safety nets, unlike where we sit, there's no unemployment insurance, there's nothing to fall back upon. And there wasn't a single fashion brand who made any type of investment in terms of direct relief. And we, as sort of a tiny nonprofit, started to run GoFundMe campaigns and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally to just get food and medical relief and urgent supplies in the hands of workers. And as we started to do that, we came together with some of our coalition members, Ashila, who is an incredible labor organizer in Sri Lanka, Nazma in Bangladesh, and said, all right, like, take butcher paper. If we were to rewrite, how are we to build back better, centering the women who make our clothes, really thinking about this from a pay her lens? What would that look like? And so our coalition website, it's payupfashion.com, has those 7 action points, and they're ordered in terms of importance. So, at a minimum, we're still demanding paying up, making sure that wages and severance are paid. But in the long term, we know that what we have to push for, and really be razor focused on pushing for, is living wages and better regulatory reform. See, it's been 30 years of voluntary efforts where the industry's been telling us, all right, we have codes of conduct, we are auditing and monitoring factories, we've got all this under control. And I think our manifesto is really here to say business is, at the end of the day, good at one thing, which is maximizing shareholder value.
Yeah.
You may dabble in some of the areas of human rights and environmental issues because there's a business case or because there's reputational damage, but we shouldn't have just the private sector, as we have had in the last 30 years, in the driver's seat. And there have to be other ways for us to get there. And, political will to get regulatory reform passed is really important. But because fashion supply chains are so fragmented, and because, it's in so many countries where you have corruption or you don't have that political will, one of the other things that we are really focused on is binding agreements. You started this conversation talking about Rana Plaza, and how that was this moment in time where so many of us woke up. Well, one of the things post Rana Plaza was that the Accord came into being, which was the first time that you had unions and brands sitting together to say, we have to make sure that these buildings are not death traps, that workers are safe, and that workers have equal voting power to make some of those commitments. Well, you know, the Accord 8 years later is set to expire. And we really look at it as a landmark win for workers to assure that there was a way for enforcement that had teeth. You know, outside of regulation, that's the only tool we truly have, binding agreements to hold brands to account. Otherwise, you can sign all manners of things. But what we've seen is every time you don't meet those goals, whether of living wage or climate targets, then the industry just changes the targets.
Yeah.
So without having anything binding or enforceable, here we are again.
Yeah, changes or moves elsewhere, right? As we've indeed seen in the UK recently, with the example of just jumping to a different market and indeed finding it cheaper again.
Right, like the Leicester became too Larry, so now they're in my home country of Pakistan. So you just keep hopping around and keep perpetuating this cycle of human rights abuses.
Do you see a world where, you know, with all of the things that you've talked about, you know, the complexity of what we've got to try and do here, and in many ways the sort of, I don't want to say that they're directly opposing, but they're two different forces of what we're trying to achieve from an environmental standpoint and what we're trying to achieve on the sort of social justice and humanitarian side of things. Do you see a world where we can move forward succeeding on both fronts?
Well, I'd have to believe that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this work for as long as I have and keep sort of a healthy degree of optimism. You know, I think this disconnect that has been painted again by brands around environment, pitting the environment versus people, is a dichotomy that's really quite false, you know, which is why at Remake, we don't just talk about climate as if it's this amorphous, you know, something that's happening around the world, because the truth is this is really about climate justice. Right? And the same people who are up against the indignities of poverty wages and slave-like working conditions are the exact same people who are on the front lines of climate shocks and, in this past year, pandemic shocks without the infrastructure or safety nets to catch them, right? In my hometown of Karachi, we are up against droughts, and, you know, in Dhaka, Bangladesh, they have cyclones. And so it's so important for us to be pushing brands around to say that the places that you're extracting value and natural resources and causing the water and air pollution are the places that you have to invest. You know, somehow offsetting and planting trees somewhere else doesn't make it a net positive move. And so if we really were to center on climate justice and gender justice, then those two things are very connected. Now, the other question that I often get is, well, you know, this is very idealistic, and at least sweatshop jobs are some manner of jobs. And, you know, if these jobs were to go away, as they will with automation, then what's these industries that are so codependent on these jobs to do? And so somehow if you're advocating for living wages, well, then it'll be a job killer. And I think that's, again, very much an industry narrative, right? Because there is a way to have a humane pace of production and to pay living wages so that you can essentially lift a generation of women out of poverty before automation comes. Because otherwise, you know, as automation is here, as we've seen in the pandemic, when demand dried up, she's just left out on the streets with nothing to fall back upon. So I really do think that taking a justice-centered lens brings people and planet together rather than decoupling the two.
And I love that you said that, because to me, obviously, as somebody working within the industry, that feels like the biggest message that has come out of the pandemic is, you know, through various different versions of this story, obviously the incredible work that you're doing, but other entities as well around this sector, has really been around the fact we have to center climate justice particularly. So thank you for that. I want to open up to questions very shortly, but just before I do, two follow-ups, just a reminder there for everybody to please post any questions that they have into the Q&A box, and we will come to them. But one of the things I just wanted to say, because I think it's so interesting, everything we've been talking about, but I'm always super aware, Rosanna and I talk a lot with our members during our roundtable discussions about the idea of our own echo chamber, and about this notion that actually, you know, so much of what we're talking about can be very easily, as you've said, it's sort of written off as being idealist. We get told every now and again, you know, that we're being too woke, that we're being very left wing, etc., etc. With all of these views that we have, you know, that's quite often the argument back, but certainly that echo chamber view, I think, is a, you know, a genuine challenge. And what I want to ask you is, how do we move outside of that? You know, if it is sort of systemic, what has to change, that sort of perception has to shift, doesn't it?
Yes. I think the number one way to do that is really to center the communities that we are all professing to fight for. You know, so within our pay up fashion demands, one of our actions is, you know, bring workers center stage, whether into any sustainability conversations, conferences, multi-stakeholder initiatives, you know, outside of fireside chats. If there are any panels or discussions, I don't do them unless there's a union leader or a worker present, because I'm just an ally, right? I'm here to use my networks, to use my connections to amplify her message. But at the end of the day, Remake was always about passing the mic back to her. Mm. And if she, as the fearless person on the front lines of these climate concerns and human rights abuses, is able to speak her truth, then that's fundamentally indisputable, whether to press, whether to fashion professionals. So I think we really do need to be remaking these connections. And I've always been struck by how many sustainable conferences, conversations are sort of led by people who've never even been in a factory, let alone made eye contact or had a meal with the actual people who make our clothes. So I think, you know, that's one way to do it. And certainly in the Zoom world, we have learned how to globally connect in a way that was never possible. Throughout the pandemic, we have been having monthly press calls with garment makers and union leaders. You know, we just had one with frontline union leaders who happen to be very young women who are also on the front lines of fighting for democracy in Myanmar. And we were able to do that on a screen. So I hope we take some of these learnings of being in an increasingly globally connected world and say, in order for us to get out of our echo chamber, well, we have to go directly to the source. I'd also say, you know, the Slackovism really makes me nervous when you talk to citizens and they're like, all right, well, I tweeted something, I said something on Facebook, I checked how many likes I have, and now I'm done. Because so much of this is a long fight, right? And we're needing to write to the right policymakers and ask the brands better questions. So we try and make it as easy as possible, because we know that we're fighting in a content world where everyone's attention span is getting smaller and smaller. So our Pay Up Fashion petition is actually connected to 200 fashion executives that get an email every time you sign the petition. So it's a way to start dialogue, you know, and connect back to citizens. So I think there's so many ways that we can use technology and this democratization of access to better connect garment makers at the end of the day, really, to the CEOs, CFOs of fashion executives, to look her in the eye and then make the case of supply chain savings.
Yeah, here. Thank you for that. I know that we've talked a fair amount around hope, obviously, throughout this conversation, but we do always try and end our interviews with that one question, which is, if you had to sum it up in a single sentence around what your hope is for the industry, whether this year or you know, longer term in the future, how would you do so?
Pay her.
Amazing.
You know, we don't want any types of charitable investments, little factory-based trainings. It's to say, you know the prices that you pay factories, those are insufficient to pay her living wages. Let's just make sure that she's paid to live a life of dignity. It's that simple.
It is that simple. Well, Ayesha, thank you so much. I'm going to welcome Rosanna back so that we can have the Q&A, and I will be back at the end for a little quick fire round to close us out. Over to you, Rosanna.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. Thank you for actually putting this hugely complex and really difficult matter very simply, actually, and also with a tone of positivity, which really helps all of us, I think, to understand it and to want to get involved. A lot of the questions that we have had come in are on precisely that. So I'm going to dig straight in. The first one is from Beth Stewart. You mentioned the Bangladesh Accord that is expiring. Is there anything sustainable fashion advocates can do about that, either in preventing that or proposing a new binding agreement?
So thank you so much for that question, Beth. And, with it being Fashion Revolution Week, there are a lot of us as activists and advocates that are demanding exactly that. One very easy way to get involved in the conversation is follow us on Instagram, Remake Our World. We're going to be having conversations with different experts around the accord expiring and what can we do about it. Really, it's about making noise and asking the right questions. But at the end of the day, it is going to come down to the political will within Bangladesh to not allow the accord to expire, and for brands to not feel like they can duck out of this conversation. I do think that with the accord expiring, there's also a deeper question of all of us demanding binding agreements, especially if there are fashion professionals within here listening, because we know that voluntary efforts have abjectly failed workers. They failed them during Rana Plaza, they failed them during the pandemic. So, if you're having the difficult conversations internally, know that signing up to something that's completely voluntary is not going to get us anywhere. So it's really time to elevate the beauty of why the accord made so many workers safe.
Mm-hmm. Right, the next one, Abigail Taylor. If voting with our wallets is not the way forward for systematic change, and you made that point so clearly, I wrote it down. What can we be doing to get involved in as individuals? Sorry, I said that in a really roundabout way, but yes, what can individuals be doing if voting with our wallets is not the best way forward?
It's really using our voice. And, I know I don't mean to sound pithy, because I think that can be quite hard and scary when you're one individual and wondering how to do it, which is why within Remake, we have an ambassador program. It's a voluntary way to bring together like-minded kindred spirits. We used to be a predominantly US conversation, but through the pandemic, we have a lot more UK ambassadors. We even have a UK community organizer. So get involved. We make it very easy to letter write, to be a part of campaigns, to fire off messages, sign petitions, but to do it as a collective and as a community, because I know that on this path of activism, trying to do it alone can be quite lonely. So I'd say find your tribe, and then come to us for reputable facts and ready to go campaigns that'll make it easy for you to raise your voice, because every single voice asking the right questions really does matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah Angold, if we reduce Western consumption to meet environmental needs, there will be mass job losses in developing countries. Is reskilling realistic, and what could it look like in reality? Is this the only option to keep workers afloat?
It's an excellent question, and I'm so glad you asked that, because a lot of the industry is really putting blinders on. We know that automation is not just coming, but it's here. I remember pre-pandemic being in a denim factory in Sri Lanka, and they were showing me very proudly this, wet processing and ways to dye the jeans, and like, look, this used to take 50 workers, and now one machine can do it. And they were so proud of this innovation. And of course, my first thought was, well, what happened to those 50 workers?
Yeah.
So there are some incredible organizations like Shimmy Technologies that are really focused on this upskilling, but also assuring that the upskilling is happening with a gender justice lens of thinking about the actual women on the factory floor and how can they be put in positions of handling technology and not being essentially losing out to their male counterparts on those jobs. But honestly, the industry is going to continue to see consolidation and attrition. Not just because of automation, not just because of changing consumption patterns, but even post-pandemic, we're seeing a lot of factories shuttering because there was really a surplus of supply. And so beyond us advocating for upskilling, what we're needing is to really be having this conversation around safety nets and severance and relief, because so many workers are not going to be absorbed back coming out of this pandemic and the economic slowdown. And I think this is a good use case for what the industry is going to look like in the future.
Yeah, and to confront now and develop now. From Ash Kuwu, given that most of us in the audience work in-house in brands within the industry, what do you think employees can be doing to drive action in their own businesses?
I was so delighted that this was predominantly people working inside the industry. I think there can often be a lot of helplessness saying, well, I'm working inside and can I make a difference? But the truth is that, some of the levers of change beyond the reputational damage that perhaps the citizen community can do from the outside in, the inside out is really quite powerful too, right? Corporations want to retain talent. They want to make sure that their employees are happy, that their employees are excited about coming to a workplace that lives up to your ideals and value systems. And so we have a lot of Remake ambassadors who are fashion professionals who in respectful manners bubble up these important questions like, hey, I noticed you're on the wrong side of the tracker when it comes to payout. This makes it very difficult for me to be excited about my job. You know, if there is a town hall with executives to be asking that question, why aren't we honoring contracts? Or how are we thinking about, you know, the wage conversation? How do we set, if you're in forecasting or in merchandising, how do these prices impact wages? So I think there are respectful ways, regardless of how junior you may be or where you may be in the industry, to be asking these questions. And as someone who's homegrown, who came from within the industry, I do say that it really is a skill set that's important. You know, too often the idealistic citizens out there that are screaming and shouting really don't know how the industry works. I think one of my superpowers is that I do know how the industry works.
Absolutely.
On the inside, I can have nuanced conversations. So for those of you on the inside, also take hope. You know, we don't just need citizens asking these questions. We need it from merchandisers, production specialists, designers, people on the inside of the belly of the beast, because that's really how we'll build this revolution.
Well said. Absolutely. Right, the last one, because we are running out of time. When you look at the big picture here, and this is from an anonymous attendee, when you look at the big picture here and with your experience across various parts of the industry, does it feel like progress has in fact been made since the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013, as we mark the anniversary this very week?
Absolutely. You know, I think progress has been made and there is still a lot of work to be done, you know, and that's really where it's hard to answer the question in a black and white way, right? One of the things that Rana Plaza taught us, and where, you know, the people behind the accord were very smart to get this binding agreement in place, was that factories did get safer. You know, building inspections did happen in a better way. There were ways that factories' building integrity was improved. And we can walk into this 80th anniversary saying, for those of us as activists, that's a win. And I really do think that it's important to celebrate wins along the way, because otherwise it can feel so overwhelming. There's burnout, right? It's to say, all right, well, this is all terrible. I'm just going to go back to my comforter. So, you know, did buildings get safe? Absolutely. Was the accord a success with warts and all? Absolutely. Is there more work to do? Yes, because you know what? The accord was focused on one very particular thing, right? Which was the structural integrity of buildings. But we weren't talking about wages and the fact that even though there were cracks in the Rana Plaza building and that workers were nervous to enter the building, they didn't have any bargaining chips. And even though they told their supervisors, they had to enter that debt trap. And that's what killed over 1,100 people, because she needed that money. And she didn't have a way to raise her voice and say, there are cracks in the building, I can't enter. And for what? You know, a $9.99 pajama pair from the children's place? Like, why? At what point will we say that, you know, this is not worth it? And there are a lot of unsafe buildings still around the world. You know, just this last week, we've seen a disaster in Cairo in Egypt. We've seen fires in my hometown of Karachi, Pakistan. So there's a lot to be done when it comes to safety. But really, when it comes to be thinking about improvements, we also have to center around wages and severance and safety nets. And that's really where we haven't made as much progress.
Yeah. Right then, so much to think about. And I know that Rachel has some final questions for you before we finish up. Before we do, just a few quick notices for everyone in our audience today. First of all, I mean, I just can't underline enough, please do donate to this brilliant cause. Ayesha has actually added a donation link directly in the chat group right here. So if you want to just click that, it's very easy to do so. And yeah, I just can't, I'm sure all of you are feeling the same after listening to this interview. It is such an important thing to do. Then I just wanted to give everybody a date for their diaries. We have Tuesday, the 11th of May confirmed for our next speaker for the FashMash Pioneers speaker series. He is Akash Mehta, who is the co-founder and CEO of Fable and Main. Now he is going to be talking about the conscious I just said conscious consumer, which is the exact thing we are not talking about, having done this. It's because it's on my mind. I'm so sorry. He is going to be talking about conscious capitalism, which is actually a very interesting notion, which I know that Rachel, my co-founder, is particularly interested in. You know, is it something that can even exist? And also, more importantly, about conservation as well, which is something integral to the hair brand, which he has co-founded. He is also the youngest ever board member of LVMH and a global guardian for UNICEF. It's going to be a really interesting discussion, and we haven't yet actually had a topic on either conservation or from the beauty space. So this is a first for us. Do please put it in your diaries, and tickets will be available from next week on our Eventbrite. Right, I think that's everything from me. One final thank you to our sponsor, Klaviyo. We couldn't do it without you. And I'm going to hand back to Rachel. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Right, Ayesha, just a very fun, quick fire to end. So I'm going to give you 2 words, if you could tell me which of them you would choose. I already know the answer to the first one now. This was written before we did the interview, I should say. Ethical consumer or active citizen?
Active citizen.
Of course. Boycott or begin a conversation?
Both. Can I say that? Boycott.
Very interesting. Localism or globalism?
Localism.
Carrot or stick?
Stick.
That's fascinating. And I, having now spoken to you, I can completely appreciate why you said that, and I couldn't agree more. Earth Day or every day?
Every day.
And 2021 or 2031?
2031.
With all of that hope and optimism in mind, indeed. Ayesha, thank you so much. I cannot express how much respect I have for you and for the work that you're doing and for the vision that you have of where this all moves. And I hope that we stay in touch and become lifelong friends, and that your work really does evolve at the pace that we all hope that it does. And I think with any luck, you've got an audience here that is now fully backing you all the more. So thank you for giving up your time, sharing your wisdom with us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing where it takes you next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been such fun, and I really do hope you all will keep in touch and follow us along, and that we have some converts in the audience of being a part of the fashion industry that we love, that we want to build back in a different way.
Totally, absolutely. I'm sure you have. Thank you so much again. And yes, thank you everyone for watching.
Bye.
Bye.